I expect that this book is quite familiar to a lot of you. It's the Reader's Digest book of folklore, myths and legends of Britain, and it started a lot of us off on a lifelong interest in folklore. One story in particular caught my eye. In Farnham in Surrey, a white witch called Mother Ludlam lived in a cave. She would lend implements to locals. All they had to do was turn up at the cave entrance at midnight, turn around 360 degrees, ask for the implement, promise to return it within a certain period of time, and then they would come back the next morning to find it there at the cave entrance. But once somebody borrowed a cauldron and didn't return it within the time allowed, Mother Ludlam never lent anything again. Eventually the cauldron found its way into nearby Waverley Abbey and then to St Mary's Church, Frensham. A following section, it says, in Frensham Church there is a great cauldron. The story associated with this one is very similar, except this one was lent by the fairies. It was also never returned, and the fairies also never lent anything again. So, does this mean there is a magical cauldron at St Mary's Church, Frensham? I had to go and find out. The oldest parts of Frensham Church date from the 13th century and the tower is 14th century. You enter through a 15th century porch. This nave looks like the oldest part of the church, and that window at the east end looks sort of late Gothic to me, maybe 15th century. And here is the cauldron. The stories are so similar that it's hard to believe they don't relate to the same item. The Farnham cauldron belonged to a white witch who lived in a cave, and the Frensham one came from the fairies. The cauldrons of both tales remained in this world because the terms of their loan had been violated. Let's start with the witch and the cave. It so happens there is a Mother Ludlam's cave quite close by.
This place derives its name from a popular story, which makes it formerly the residence of a white witch called Mother Ludlam, or Ludlow. Not one of those malevolent beings mentioned in the demonology. This old lady neither killed hogs, rode on broomstaves, nor made children vomit nails and crooked pins. On the contrary, Mother Ludlam, instead of injuring when properly invoked, kindly assisted her poor neighbours in their necessities by lending them such culinary utensils and household furniture as they wanted for particular occasions. The petitioner went to the cave at midnight, turned 3 times round, and thrice repeated aloud, "Pray, good Mother Ludlam, lend me such a thing, and I will return it within 2 days." He or she then retired, and coming again early the next morning, found at the entrance the requested movable.
Mother Ludlam's name is interesting. It's been suggested it may derive from the mythical King Lud, who turns up in medieval literature, such as that by Geoffrey of Monmouth, or in the Mabinogion, for example. Now, Geoffrey presented his work as history, but his King Lud probably derived in part from a mythical Welsh hero, who in turn derived elements from a Celtic god of healing, Nodens. That interests me because springs like this are often associated with healing too, and so are cauldrons. In the Mabinogion, the Welsh hero Bran has a magical cauldron which can bring the dead back to life.
Ac yna dechreuodd y gwyddel gynnau tân, o dan crochan ar eilen. And then the Irish began to kindle a fire under the cauldron of rebirth. And then the dead bodies were cast into the cauldron until it was full. And on the morrow they would arise as good fighting men as before, save they were not able to speak.
Another idea, and this one doesn't exclude the King Lud one, is that the stream of water itself was called the Ludwell from a pretty early date. We know that because of the annals of nearby Waverley Abbey. Waverley Abbey was a Cistercian abbey, founded in the 12th century. In the year 1216, their water source dried up. It had been called the Ludwell.
The spring of our lavatory, called Ludwell, was almost totally empty and dried up. A certain monk of this house, named Brother Simon, took it seriously into consideration by what contrivance it might soonest and most conveniently be rectified, water with great difficulty being found. He caused the streams to descend to one place by means of a certain subterraneous duct to form a perpetual running spring. This was called St. Mary's Spring.
Lead pipes have been found here. It seems that Brother Simon's chronicled works are backed up by the archaeology. It also caught my eye that they named the spring St. Mary's Spring, and the place where our Cauldron lives is called St. Mary's Church. I recently spoke to writer Francis Young about sacred springs, their naming and their identity.
Now, my own speculation is that sometimes these ladies that wells were associated with could possibly have been supernatural beings who later became identified with the Virgin Mary. Holy wells stand out in this regard. They were places where popular religion could thrive without very much reference to the church. And I think that kind of official takeover, official assimilation of popular cults happens a great deal. But where it doesn't happen, you will get these cults of saints being venerated at wells. Sometimes they are saints who don't appear anywhere else, so they appear to be particular to the people. They have no kind of official standing whatsoever. And so, yeah, you do get this kind of disconnected popular Christianity, which thrives quite separate from the approval of the church. And when talking about the Middle Ages, I always make this distinction between the church on the one hand and Christianity on the other. And they're not necessarily the same thing. They don't map perfectly onto one another. Because, of course, Christianity is a vast and complex cultural phenomenon with all its kind of popular eccentricities, which is much greater than what the church can actually regulate and enforce.
This means we possibly have a pre-Christian holy site, a healing well, that was Christianised later. Okay, so we've covered the Mother Ludlam theory, but in one of our stories, the cauldron was lent not by a witch, but by the fairies.
In the vestry here, on the north side of the chancel, is an extraordinary great kettle or cauldron, which the inhabitants say by tradition was brought hither by the fairies, time out of mind, from Borough Hill. To this place, if anyone went to borrow a yoke of oxen, money, etc., he might have it for a year or longer, so he kept his word to return it. There is a cave, where some have fancied to hear music. On this Borough Hill is a great stone lying along the length of about 6 feet. They went to this stone and knocked at it, and declared what they would borrow and when they would repay, and a voice would answer when they should come, and that they should find what they desired to borrow at that stone, This cauldron was borrowed here after the manner aforesaid, but not returned according to the promise. And although the cauldron was afterwards carried to the stone, it could not be received, and ever since that time, no borrowing here.
Like a lot of fairy lore, the devil took over the fairy part in later eras, and there are 3 hills about 1.5 miles south of St Mary's Church called the Devil's Jumps. The road to the south of them is still called Jumps Road. Unfortunately, the sites on this illustration aren't accessible. I did try to look, but not far away there are other features that make me think of fairies. Frensham Common is pretty rural these days. It's the kind of place you go for a walk, for a bit of peace and quiet. But it's been continually settled for the last few thousand years, sometimes quite densely. And about 3,000 years ago, the people who were here built the structure behind me. It's a Bronze Age bowl barrow, and it isn't alone. There are several of them on the heath. They sometimes accommodated the dead. Continuing relationships with the dead are an incredibly consistent feature of religion. The traits of the dead are also pretty consistent. They can think even though they don't have bodies, and they can relate to the people they've left behind and sometimes help them. It's been theorised that even into Christian times, that the pre-Christian notions of the fate of the dead fed into their ideas of the supernatural. And it's one explanation for the origin of those eerie creatures, elves or fairies. There's more than one traditional tale of people going underground and stealing fairy vessels or cups. 12th century chronicler Gervase of Tilbury told of a man who saw light streaming out from an open fairy hill. He went in to see the inhabitants feasting. He was offered a glass of wine, but having more sense than to drink it, he threw the wine on the floor and escaped with the cup, which was eventually presented to King Henry II. The goblet was of an unknown material, of unusual colour and extraordinary form. A similar story comes from Edenhall, Penrith, where a servant supposedly stole a cup from the fairies, although the cup came with a curse. If it was ever broken, the good luck of Edenhall would break with it. For that reason, the cup was treasured and cared for centuries. Edenhall's luck did eventually run out, though. The family ran out of money and the hall was demolished in 1934. But luckily, the cup survived. The Luck of Edenhall wasn't made by the fairies, though. It was made by some very skilled craftsmen from Syria or Egypt. It was sometimes thought to be brought back from the Crusades. That would make it the right time for Gervase of Tilbury's fairy story in the 12th century, but it's been more accurately dated to the 13th century, over 100 years later. You can see from this piece the effect that Islamic art had on the European movement that became known as Gothic. Where does this cauldron really come from? Well, Nathaniel Salmon had a theory. It need not raise any man's wonder for what use it was, there having been many in England till very lately to be seen, as well as very large spits which were given for the entertainment of the parish at the wedding of poor maids. So, it seems that the cauldron was a community facility, one that was common enough back in the day. But I think we're looking at more than one community cooking pot here. I think we're seeing the tangled threads of various mythical elements, cauldrons and goblets, magical and religious sites, and caves and springs that promote healing. England is fantastic to live in. It's full of this stuff. But just remember, whether you borrow something from a witch or a fairy, remember to return it.